Alrighty. Hello, everyone. Thank you for joining us this morning. Please give us a few minutes while we wait for others to join in. All right. Hello, everyone, and welcome to today's virtual tour of the Timken Museum. We're so excited to have you with us this morning. A few housekeeping rules. Before we get started, please keep yourselves muted throughout today's presentation. If you have any questions, please feel free to use the Zoom chat function by clicking the button at the bottom of your screen that says chat in order to type your question, and we'd be happy to address any questions or comments at the end of today's tour. If you're joining us over on Facebook Live, welcome to you as well. You can also ask any questions you may have using the comment section on Facebook, and we'll be monitoring, I always struggle with that word, sorry, those comments and answering those questions at the end of the tour as well. Lastly, this tour is being recorded and streamed live and will be posted to our social media channels once the tour is over. If you would like to rewatch this tour or watch other tours put on by the Timken Museum previously, please check out our YouTube or our Facebook pages to find those. Without further ado, I'm so excited to introduce Docent Almerson, who will be presenting the origins of landscape painting. Thank you so much for being with us. I'll turn things over to you.
Thank you so much, Renata. Our new intern at the Timken, a very important position because it really facilitates our docent work, in particular our lectures. So the topic today is the origins of landscape painting in Western art. I did limit it to Western art because as you might know, Chinese art is steeped in magnificent landscape painting beginning in the 6th century. And it really was a true art form much earlier than it was in European art, but it would take several lectures to include art that was created in China, for example. So we're going to concentrate on landscape in Western art. What is landscape painting? Landscape painting reveals mountains, valleys, trees, rivers, forests, all the beauty of the natural world. But it really wasn't an independent genre till much later in Western art. It really begins to emerge around the very late part of the 15th century and the 16th century, early part of the 16th century, when we look at the work of Bellini and Giorgione, Venetian Renaissance artists, who begin to really capture the landscape predominantly in their painting. When we look at some of the earlier examples of landscape painting, we see a modicum of landscape painting beginning to emerge even in archaic times. And so we're going to start to look at that. A couple things too is that landscape painting has rather types of landscape painting, and that really doesn't solidify until much later, 16th and 17th century. But the categories would be something like this: the pastoral landscapes, which are very human. It would be something like you would see with John Constable in the 19th century, of man coexisting peacefully in nature. When you look at picturesque landscapes, you might think of the work of the Baroque painter Poussin and Claude Lorrain, because they're beautiful, picturesque landscapes. And also we have what are called sublime landscapes. And sublime landscapes would be, if you saw the work of Bierstadt, for example, which we're going to look at, where you see maybe large avalanches or glaciers or huge mountain ranges. That means the land is so magnificent and sublime. But a really important category that we see much earlier is what is called Arcadian landscapes. And you know, it comes from ancient Greece, this idea of Arcadia, this actually a desolate place, but it began to emerge more as a beautiful place, a place of beauty and calmness. So that is also seen in landscapes. Now, landscape also comes from the Dutch word landschap, and then later changed to landskip, But why is it so important? Because the Dutch in the 17th century, with the works of Hobbema and Van Rysdale, really focused just on landscape painting. So we are not going to talk about this too much. Right now, we're looking at the work of Joachim Patner, who was actually French. And he does this landscape with Sharon. Oh, it is magnificent. And we will talk about that as we move up a little bit in the presentation. So what I want to talk about first is, after the fall of the Roman Empire, depicting landscape was not very prominent. But we do need to, before we look at the Romans, we're going to look at this exquisite Minoan series of frescoes. And this is a triptych because it is obviously 3 panels, 2 walls, and the central panel. And this is on the island of Santorini. Many of you probably have visited. Sometimes it is called Thera from ancient times. Thera also represents the name of the volcano that erupted just after this fresco was painted, 1500 before Christian era, and it buried everything. When you think of buried civilizations, you think of, everybody thinks of what happened in Rome, in Herculaneum and Pompeii. But there were other civilizations, and this one happens to be a Minoan, where the beautiful artifacts that were created were buried under volcanic ash. Now, fortunately, in the case of the spring frescoes in Akrotiri, the people fled before the big volcanic eruption. So what we had is very few deaths, unlike what happened in Pompeii and Herculaneum, but we had magnificent artifacts that withstood the test of time because of the burial. I did happen to visit Akrotiri. It was amazing. So let's look at this particular fresco. It's called the Spring Fresco. What you see here is mountains or hills with beautiful vegetation, flowering vegetation. And in the center panel, I'm just going to see, hopefully my pointer, are 2 birds. Now, originally it was thought that these were lovebirds, and this was a kind of a romantic landscape. But ornithologists subsequently looked at it and said, no, these are probably male fighting birds. Suffice to say, probably are the fighting birds, but look at the coloration, the yellows, the reds, these are organic colors, and it's a fresco, so it means the wet paint was applied to wet walls and then it dried. The thing that you will see here is a limit in perspective, because it really wasn't until we look at the Roman frescoes and then in the early Renaissance, artists begin to grapple with the idea of perspective and 3-dimensionality, and that is in creation of landscapes. So I'm going to move on to the next image, and hopefully I can for a little bit. Here we go. This is landscape from the scene of the Odyssey. This is a remarkable Roman landscape, and it was found in 1848 in Esquiline Hill in Rome. And these are remarkable landscapes in what is called the second style, or the architectural style of wall painting. The Romans did 4 styles, and this is probably the most interesting one to me because it creates a window. If you look at the left, you see what looks like a calm bucolic scene with these engaged pilasters. A pilaster is an engaged column. Now, remember, this is trompe l'oeil, meaning even though it looks like it's like a bas relief of a pilaster, no, it's painted with that nice Corinthian capital there. So one side we see like it looks like hunting or a little bit of a more relaxed landscape. How does the artist achieve dimensionality? What they do is they create darker tonalities in the foreground of the painting, and as the landscape goes to the middle ground and background, you start to see a lighter tonality. That gives dimensionality, and the Romans kind of figure that out. On the right, we have a very interesting fresco, and what it is the Laestrygonians, who in the Odyssey were a race of giants that ate humans, and they were descendants of Poseidon. So that is kind of a rough general description of what they're doing, but they are preparing for battle. So it's an imaginary world. It comes from the Odyssey, Homer's Odyssey, a wonderful epic poem, but you begin to see the use of landscape. hills, there's a little bit of water, we see boats, we see figures interacting, and we begin to see a sort of a manner of three-dimensionality. Now we're going to fast forward because really landscape painting takes a back seat. As I mentioned, it's really after the fall of the Roman Empire, we begin to see a much more religious and controlled series of paintings. And so when the Catholic Church controls a lot of what is painted, we have less of an interest in the landscape and nature and more in religious and spiritual subject matter. Let's, however, look at the work of Giotto. Giotto was a Florentine. He was a student of Cimabue, and he paints in the early part of the latter part of the 1300s, mid to 1300s, and he paints this magnificent fresco in St. Francis Church in Assisi. Now, you can see beautiful frescoes by Giotto, not only in the St. Francis Church, where 28 visions of the life of St. Francis are documented, but you can also see some of his beautiful works in the Arena Chapel in Padua. So he was probably we would consider Giotto the father of Renaissance painting. And in this magnificent fresco from St. Francis Church, we see St. Francis giving his mantle to the poor. And what Giotto did that was so remarkable is he began to really look at the natural world. He was interested in detail, the natural world. He was also experimenting with perspective and three-dimensionality. Even though this is in a deeply recessed space, you begin to see a bit of perspective here, and you also see a volume in the figures. As St. Francis hands the mantle to the poor, you see a halo. It's that gold halo, and you see three-dimensional figures, and he hands a beautiful cloak bathed in golden light, and we see a horse to the left, my left. And the horse represents movement and transportation. So there's kind of that element subliminally presented of movement and actually very, very obviously presented too because of a horse and transportation, but it is subtle that there has been movement into the picture frame. And then we have a landscape, the trees on the mountainsides and a beautiful fortress on the left as it goes into the sky. And then we have a church on the right. So Giotto is considered the father of Renaissance art. And we see this architectural element, we see the beautiful use of color, and we see images from the life of St. Francis. Now, before landscape painting really begins to emerge as a standing work alone genre, which is really more 16th and 17th century, in the 15th century, we begin to see a lot of use of landscapes to aid in the beauty of manuscript illumination. So probably the most important illuminated manuscripts created in the early part of the Renaissance would be the Lettres Richeuses. And the Lettres Richeuses was made for the Duc de Berry. The Duc de Berry was part of the Burgundian court, and he was a bibliophile. He almost went bankrupt in his quest to have the most amazing library to perpetuate amazing legacy of books and have the greatest artists, for example, the Limburg brothers, make these beautiful handmade books. So it is important to note that 1440 was the beginning of the printing press, and then books began to be made handmade. Mass produced, but handmade books were what was done before 1440. These handmade books could take years. Often multiple artists worked on them. Now, Lettres Richeuses, which were calendars and canonical prayers, meaning 7 times a day certain prayers would be said. It also documented what would happen in the seasons and the months of the year. I do want to tell you, however, that there is a mistake in the titling of this page from Lettres Richeuses. It is not September. This is January. And I apologize because somewhere there was a glitch made quite a while ago and the wrong page. Now, however, this is probably the more beautiful page. The one in September actually does show peasants in a landscape. So I apologize, this does not reveal a tremendous amount of landscape, but you do see it in the middle register of this page. Now, the Burgundian court was overseeing the Netherlandish region and the Limburg brothers were Dutch and lived in the Netherlandish regions. So that we have this quest for the French court to have these beautiful books, and eventually the Habsburg, I think, was 1467, they took over. But at this time, the French court was very important, and this international Gothic style was predominant. International Gothic was use of beautiful jewel-like tones, and you see that in the clothing of these aristocrats, and some other like remarkable aspects to it. The use of natural pigments is pretty obvious. We have everything from this exquisite blue, lapis, saffron yellow. What is happening in this page? We have the aristocrats. There is an important noble, and he's on the right. Hopefully this pointer will show him, and he's in a fur-lined hat. He's got the fleur-de-lis. You can see some of the fleur-de-lis and some of the embellishments here. Fleur-de-lis, of course, the French royal court. And they're at a banquet because January was the time when great gifts were given, and you see all this manner of gold. And then we see animals, which were very typical of the court. And then we have a feast. It's kind of funny because you see little animals on the table dining on the plates, sort of gross. And here in the right-hand corner, these two figures, one with a red mantle and a hat, these are two of the Limburg brothers. There were actually 3 Limburg brothers who worked on this manuscript, but they were not the only ones. Many other artists had to finish it. The Limburg brothers died young. They died of plague. And so other artists had to come in. Lastly, I want to talk about the landscape. So we have what looks like a landscape with a castle and soldiers pouring out of an archway. The soldiers either represent a contemporary version of the Trojan War or references a British battle that the French were facing. It's not quite determined, but they are in 15th century garb. This landscape here with the hills and the beauty, it is actually a tapestry. So it's a landscape within a page of a painting, a tapestry on the wall of this dining hall. And then we have these beautiful gold Corinthian capitals and the gold objects that were given. But here we have an we have the beautiful stars in the night sky. And then we have this tapestry here and a scene from the life of the French court. So that is from an illuminated manuscript. Another illuminated manuscript in a little bit later is another book by a man named George Trubert. George Trubert was French. He was from Provence, but he spent most of his career in the 15th century, early part of the 16th century as a manuscript illuminator. And usually Christian liturgical pages are all that's left. Here we have St. John the Evangelist, and he has been relegated to the island of Patmos, a Greek island, and he was the only saint that was not executed, and he survived, but he here is writing supposedly the book of Revelations, and we have an eagle and an inkwell and a container for his writing implement, and he's busily writing. And then we have this eagle sort of observing what's happening. The eagle represents St. John. He represents the fact that the eagle could look into the sun, would be able to prophesy. And also the eagle represents wisdom, of course, St. John. Then we have this beautiful landscape. We have a rocky promontory here with looks like a building. And then we have, again, to the right, a harbor and more buildings and little boats, and everything is out of perspective. We have the much larger St. John, who is much grander, and then, of course, the island, which is not in perspective. But we are beginning to see landscapes. So it's not only just the land that we're seeing also seascapes begin to emerge. Now, we're going to move away from miniatures, illuminated manuscripts, and we're going to go into painting. And we're going to look at the marvelous Pages Christus. And if you are not familiar with our collection, I hope that one day you go and see our magnificent The Death of the Virgin. It's just a hugely important Pages Christus. It is in the Timken Museum. Pages Christus was a very important Flemish painter. He worked in Bruges, and he was probably a student of the great Jan van Eyck. It is said that he was a student of Jan van Eyck. Others say he was just familiar with the work of Jan van Eyck, but he took the mantle from Jan van Eyck as being the greatest painter in the 15th century in Bruges. Pages Christus was also influenced by the great Roger van der Weyden and also others like Hans Memling, but he was considered one of the most important painters in the early North in Renaissance. The Virgin and Child in an Archway. Look at how exquisitely he creates this landscape behind this low bench and balustrade. And this landscape is hyper detailed. You can see exquisite hills and trees and the water and tiny little boats on the water. How is he able to do this? First of all, many of these early artists who worked in Bruges and Ghent and Antwerp, they trained as manuscript illuminators. So they were very careful to detail the tiniest elements of a painting. We can see the beautiful landscape. We can also see the detail, even how the Christ child holds the crystal orb, which means Salvator Mundi, savior of the world, and the Virgin looks at him longingly. Pages Christus was known to be one of the originators of single point perspective in Western art. Now, you did see the beginning of perspective as we saw in the Roman frescoes, but it's really, when you look at single point perspective, we really have to look at the work of Pages Christus. Like Jan van Eyck, he helped to advance the use of oil paints. And you can see how rich and colorful the robe of the Virgin. Now, she's almost always depicted in red and blue, and we can see that. And yet we have also this very detailed, it almost looks like a landscape in the interior of her robe, and then this highly detailed floor and carving on this low wall, and then the winding pathways. It's just a magnificent oak on panel. Remember, it wasn't until really the 16th century that canvas really became much more often used. You see it a lot with the Venetian Renaissance painters. Quickly, before I move on, I wanted to show you that this was in these pilasters, these engaged columns. We also have at the top Adam and Eve. Now, as we move on and we get a little farther into the talk, you will see more and more landscapes emerge. Probably the most important, or one of the most important artists of the Northern Renaissance, was the great German artist from Nuremberg, Albrecht Dürer. So Dürer was not only a painter, he was a writer. He did watercolors, gouaches, printmaking, engravings. He really promoted all manner of creation of art. He went into Italy a couple times. His work was loved by the Italians. He brought Italian work back to the North. He was a very important artist. One thing I want to tell you is that many times when you talk to people, when you talk about Renaissance, they think about the great Leonardo da Vinci and Michelangelo and Raphael and Botticelli. Of course, the most important artists, but you also have to remember the North had great artists, Albrecht Dürer, and we're going to look at the work of Pieter Brueghel the Elder and others who really were important Renaissance artists, but they happened to live in the North. So Dürer was a traveler. 1494, he went to Venice. He went back in 1498. He became very famous. He perpetuated a lot of interest in his work because he did these series, some of them religious, like the Apocalypse series, for example. But this is a pure landscape. And it's the view of Arco from the valley in the Tyrol. So I wanted to mention that the Arco is a very interesting location because it borders both parts of Austria and also parts of Italy. The southern Tyrol is actually in Italy, and this is probably the southern Tyrol because he went into Italy to paint, but he also was in Austria and Germany. So he knew this region very well. But the Arco is considered Italian. So we're going to focus on the Italian aspect of this painting. It's a beautiful town nestled at the foot of the dramatic hilltop with a castle on top. And so this castle, I believe, is from the 12th century, and it's a fortified castle, and it kind of winds its way up this beautiful mountaintop. Now, this is gouache. Gouache gives this very deep and rich color to the image. It's not just a straight watercolor, which of course is water-based, but gouache adds a dimension. It's a white coloring agent and it adds dimensionality. And you get these vibrant, vibrant colors. There's something very, very interesting in this watercolor plus gouache. And if you look here where my cursor is, if you look, you can see a profile of an angry man. And it starts here, and here's the face, and then the ear is the part of the mountaintop that is in shadow. But you get this exquisite hilltop with architectural elements, but you also have this hidden subliminal message. Now we have vineyards and forests here, olive groves and olive groves and vineyards and these beautiful trees. And again, a fortified castle here. But suffice to say, this is one of the most successful watercolor gouaches ever created. And then we have the stippling here. Originally, when I looked at it, I thought it might be a deterioration of the paper, but it also states that he purposely did it almost like little cloud formations. And I can't say 100% what that is. And then, of course, at the very top, you see the A and D, which was the very prominent signature of Albert Dürer. Now, we talked a little bit about this in the beginning. This is by Joachim Pantiner, and he lived from 1480 to 1524. He was an amazing painter. He was from the Flemish Renaissance. He loved to paint history and landscape paintings. He worked in Antwerp. He was a pioneer of early landscape painting. And he began to, whether he knew it or not, create a more independent genre, because so much of this particular painting is an incredible landscape. He was also a good friend of Dürer, so he knew the work of Dürer, Quentin Metzys, a lot of very important people. Here, the landscape dwarfs the figures. And what are we looking at? So we're looking at the poem from the Aeneid by Virgil, and we see in mythology this idea of that Charon, who was the guide down the river Styx to determine the last judgment. So it has a Christian overture of the last judgment, the idea of the last judgment, but it also has mythological judging. Are you going to what would be heaven or hell? And so Charon was a navigator down the river Styx, and we have hell on my right and heaven on the left. We see a little figure, diminutive figure, and the figure is asked to choose hell and damnation or heaven and beauty. Ironically enough, the little figure looks to hell. And so it's interesting to note that person has made an interesting choice. So we have hell. Now, remember, when these artists depict hell, they're also depicting the concept of the plague that has been raging through Europe. We also see Cerberus, the three-headed dog, who at the entrance to the river Styx will greet the person who will enter. And we have people sort of melting, very Bosch-like. If you look at the Garden of Earthly Delights, you know that this is very Bosch-inspired. On the left, this magnificent crystalline blue and heaven with angels, and this water, the fountain of heaven here. And it's magnificent. And you can see how the clouds emerge and the water and the trees and you little figures, but you see how the landscape becomes prominent. And we will see this again when we look at the work of Pieter Brueghel. Pieter Brueghel the Elder was, again, one of the most important Northern Renaissance painters. What we are looking at is the Parable of the Sower from our very own Timken collection, one of my absolute favorite paintings in the Timken. A little side note, even though you can see that this is an exquisite work of art, please visit the Timken in our Dutch and Flemish gallery and see how deep and how much the colors resonate. It's so much more beautiful. But this masterpiece is on view at the Timken. So Pieter Brueghel the Elder came from Breda, which is on the Dutch and Flemish border. And at this time, the Netherlandish region was one continuous region. It wasn't until about 50 years later that we had the bifurcation of Holland and Belgium. And At this time, the Protestant Reformation had already been in full force. 1517 with Martin Luther, the 95 edicts on the church door, we begin to see the evolution of the Protestant Reformation. John Calvin, Martin Luther, and others are promoting it. So I state that because Pieter Brueghel the Elder did not only Protestant themes, but he also did Catholic themes. This is more of a Protestant theme here. Pieter Brueghel the Elder was taught probably by his grandmother Anne. He had descendants who were great artists, Jan Brueghel, who was called Velvet Brueghel, who was a landscape painter. I'm sorry, still life painter. And then his son, Pieter Brueghel the Younger, who was a genre and landscape painter. So this was a very important family. So he painted Catholic and Protestant subject matter. And here we have the parable of the sower from Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. What you sow, you shall reap, of course. And in the foreground, we have a farmer sowing seeds for a crop. We have the middle ground, which is an exquisite river as it meanders its way through the rocky landscape and this village, this Netherlandish village of the 16th century. And then we have on the bank a cluster of people. And this represents the parable, what you sow, you shall reap. And as Jesus is proselytizing, he is sowing seeds of conversion. So that is where the allegory of the parable. Brueghel loved to do parables. He actually went to Italy and worked with a man, Hieronymus Koch, who did books of parables. And Pieter Brueghel the Elder was the illustrator. Now, I want to point out a couple very interesting things. Of course, the importance of the church in this time period. We have a farmer, these beautiful trees, this magnificent landscape, foreground, middle ground, background. There's a little bit of humor to me in a sense in this, because Pieter Brueghel the Elder did not have Alps or mountains in the region in which he came from, because, as you know, the Low Countries, Holland and Belgium, and parts of Luxembourg and a little bit of France, did not have mountain ranges. So he saw them when he went into Italy to work with Hieronymus Koch and do these wonderful parable drawings and paintings. So he incorporated them because he thought they were so exquisite. So it's what we call artistic license. So I'm going to move on to another amazing work by Pieter Brueghel. And you can see we're in the 16th century, we're in the Renaissance. And you see that they begin to really understand perspective, and they can create this sort of three-dimensionality in the work. And the Dutch and Flemish, Pieter Brueghel, of course, being one of the Dutch and Flemish artists, they were very interested in the natural world. They became very interested in science. 100 years later, a little less than 100 years later, the microscope is invented, the telescope, optical devices, looking at scientific development is really important. And Pieter Brueghel was aware of this. And so when he looks at the landscape, he really studies the nature of them. Now, this would be called a landscape and a genre painting. It's the Harvesters. It's one of 6. It was a commission by a wealthy man, and he wanted to decorate his home. One thing I do want to point out, the Dutch, especially a little bit later when we get into the 17th century, loved to decorate their homes. They weren't decorating castles so much as homes, and they love landscapes and still lifes. And that's why landscapes and still life become very prominent in this region, because of this quest to enliven their homes with beautiful works of art. So we have the Harvesters. This is a very humanistic approach to mankind. We look at them, they're harvesters in the field, and they're doing very hard labor. And they're looked at with understanding. We really don't see that too much until we look at the work of Millet in the 19th century. We'd have to fast forward almost 300 years to see it more typically, but we will focus on, he does give a sense of that these people are performing an important duty, and they do it humbly. And then, of course, where does this occur? The wheat fields, this exquisite three-dimensional wheat fields, as the people go through the narrow corridors. We see the scythe here as he's cutting down the wheat, and then the people enjoying a midday meal. And it's in the hot sun. This is summertime. So we see them resting under a little bit of shade, and you get this exquisite landscape. You see workers in the field, you see structures, you see waterways, really quite important. But there is a religious pretext in the fact that they're working together and and harvesting. Probably what we're going to now move to Italy for a while, and we're going to look at one of the greatest artists who ever lived, and that was the magnificent Leonardo da Vinci. So much is known about Leonardo da Vinci. I think people are always fascinated by him. And so we know he was a sculptor, an architect, a draftsman, a designer. He worked on flying machines and anatomical structures, cannons, some pretty extreme military devices. He lived in many places in Italy and France. Well, not many places in France. He did die in Paris. He worked for the French court. He was born in Da Vinci, and he later moved to Milan. He worked in Florence. He worked in Rome for many of the great aristocratic houses of Italy. And his notebooks, he wasn't a prodigious painter. Very few of his paintings are extant today, but we do have his wonderful books of drawings and the codex and all those exquisite studies that he did. He worked in Rome from 1513 to 1516, much after this was done. Later, 1517, he moved to France and began to work for the French court, but many people are enamored with this work. So there are actually two versions of this Virgin of the Rocks. One, I believe, is in England, and one, of course, here in the Louvre Museum. This is probably one of the most beautiful Renaissance paintings ever created. And it's in, of course, the 15th century, where, again, we begin to see the use of landscape in Italian painting, too. So Jesus is with John the Baptist, and he is with, so we have the Virgin Mary, the baby Jesus, and we have John the Baptist as he's held with, baby Jesus is held with the Gabriel, ancient Gabriel, and he's holding his fingers in benediction. And then we have John, his cousin, being held by the Virgin Mary. So baby Jesus, Gabriel, Virgin Mary, and John. And they're in a pyramidal structure. There's a very successful structure that Leonardo da Vinci uses to create this beautiful spiritual religious scene and also this monumentally beautiful landscape. What Leonardo really introduces, not only perspective, three-dimensionality, but this use of shadowing, shading. Around the eyes of the Virgin and the faces, we have what's called sfumato, the smoky shading. And then when we have the light pouring in, we have chiaroscuro. And here, this chiaroscuro is the light as it comes through the cavern, the grotto. This grotto refers not only to a landscape, but it also relates to an immaculate conception. The haze of the mountains is very spiritual, elegant grotto. She seems to emerge from it. And then we have this water and slight reflections in the plants. It's just remarkable. And she holds her head over loving benediction over her child. And then this beautiful face of the Madonna. But here we can see that because Leonardo was so interested in scientific discovery and scientific aspects, he does incorporate very detailed elements to this oil on panel. We are now going to move to the Venetian Renaissance. And the Venetian Renaissance is one of my favorites because we look at the work of the Bellini brothers and the work of Giorgione and Titian, probably one of the greatest painters of the 16th century, or over the last few hundred years, actually. We will look at really, and I'm sorry, there's a misspelling on Giorgione. The O and R should have been reversed, so I apologize. So Giorgione was sad because everybody loved him. He was kind of like Raphael in that he was well-loved, he had a great presence, magnificent artist. He trained with the Bellinis, but Giovanni Bellini in particular, because there was Giacomo, the father, and then two Bellini brothers. He trained with Giovanni Bellini. He also worked with the younger artists of his group, Titian. Many of the paintings attributed to Giorgione were also thought that Titian worked on, because sadly, Giorgione died about age 30, 32 to be precise, of plague. So who knows what he would have done with his career as this wonderful artist. This is probably considered the first truly landscape painting in Western art, truly independent genre, because we are focusing, this is not religious, because one thing I should have mentioned earlier, why landscape painting really didn't take off until much later. First of all, the control of the Catholic Church and religious paintings being prominent, but also the fact that mythological, religious, historical, allegorical paintings always took precedent. But then we began to see that artists saw that they could incorporate, pardon me, excuse me, they could incorporate allegorical themes and make the landscape very prominent. So what is a tempest? A tempest is a windstorm. And you begin to see these magnificent clouds. You see sort of wind rustling in the trees. And we see a figure here. And he's a soldier, perhaps. He's in contrapposto, that is weight shift. And then we have this woman. And some people say she was a Roma or a traveler, used to be called gypsies. That's kind of a pejorative term. And she's naked, basically naked. And the baby is suckling from her breast, but he's not in the typical Madonna and Child kind of configuration. You also actually see her pubic region is a little bit more prominent. Nudeness is sort of interesting. We have a stork in the painting right here that relates to the love of a mother for its child. We have magnificent buildings. We have waterways and a bridge or an aqueduct. And we see this woman looking at us with a rather quizzical look. He uses these soft greens and blues. Unlike the Florentine Renaissance artists who were working at the same time, the Venetian Renaissance artists were known for their exquisite use of color. Color was the most important to them. Maybe for the Florentine artists in the Renaissance, it was line, but they loved nature. This is just an exquisite version of how nature was important to them. And as I always run out of time in the beginning, I'm going to keep moving. Now, this is either by Titian or Giorgione. And if you look at this pastoral concert, fête champêtre, a party outside sort of thing. And again, we're not completely sure if it's Titian or Giorgione, but this was such an important painting in European art that even later, when we look at the work of Manet and his magnificent Déjeuner sur l'Aube, you saw that he actually kind of copied this. So this is an allegory of poetry and music. We have a sculptural form pouring water. It can also relate to the four elements: fire, water, earth, and water. And we also, I hope I said those correctly. And then we have, earth, wind, fire, and water. I misspoke. And then we have these women. So it could be the beauty of lyrical poetry, the importance of music, because we do actually have three musicians. It could also be these women would be kind of visionary, like just imaginative, dreamlike state that they're looking at these figures. But we see a shepherd here, exquisite trees, highly detailed landscape, this beginning of three-dimensionality, and these sculptural forms. And again, we're going to move on because I'm a little bit delayed. Titian. So we'll talk about the greatest Venetian artist of the 16th century was probably Titian. He was a magnificent portrait painter. He could do allegorical paintings, historical paintings. The aristocrats loved him. He painted under Giovanni Bellini and the older Giorgione, but he also worked in tandem with Giorgione on many paintings. He received international fame. He did portraits for the Emperor Charles V, head of the Holy Roman Empire, and he was steeped in psychological understanding. Probably his most famous painting is the Venus of Urbino. But look at the magnificence of this. So the Rape of Europa comes from the Metamorphosis, which is a narrative poem by Ovid. And it talks about, and it was also known in Greek mythology that, Zeus frolicked with the mortals. And how did he frolic with the mortals? To kind of keep away from Hera, his wife. What he would do is transform himself. Sometimes he would transform himself into raindrops or gold, coins, a fountain of gold. But here he transforms himself into this benign white bull. And the bull is not so benign, because what he does is he looks like a beautiful bull. And when Europa saw the bull on the land, she put a garland of flowers around him. And that's when the bull took it upon himself to whisk her away. Now, she is in a very difficult state. She is being taken away. She is being hauled off. She's kidnapped, and she's in a very bad position. You can see she's flayed. I mean, she's trying to regain footing. She doesn't want to be taken away. She rape. This red scarf kind of denotes that there's something difficult happening. We have also a horrible sea monster watching. We have a little putti on another sea creature, and these little angels, putti, going after her, these little with bow and arrow, and then we people on the shore screaming, where are you? What's happening? She did get taken to the island of Crete, where she lived. She did have 3 children with Zeus, and so she remained there. A very sad and difficult story, but look at the exquisite color, how the color resonates. It's red and rich, and there's movement and power and deep beauty in this painting. We're going to continue now, and we're going to look at Baroque painting in France. Probably one of the most important Baroque painters who incorporated landscape and work is Nicolas Poussin. Along with Claude Lorrain, they were the most important French Baroque landscape painters. He was influenced by Titian and Raphael. His career was mostly in Rome. Although he was a French painter, he did go to Rome. He loved to paint classical antiquity. He was a Baroque painter, but mythological subjects were really important to him. And eventually his work became so important that even in the 19th century, artists like Cézanne and earlier Jacques-Louis David were really mesmerized by his work. So what do we have at Arcadia Ego? Well, first of all, Arcadia, the landscape of beauty and calmness that comes from the Greek. Also, what it really means is, even in antiquity, or even in Arcadia, I am there. What is I? I being death. Death is there. And even in beauty and calmness and antiquity, we have death present. What is really interesting too here is this form has a shadowy drawing, and that's one of the first shadows actually shown in Western art as well. So we have a sculptural figure, this woman who represents art, and she's looking to these shepherds who are looking at, like, we're looking at a window of history. But what could also be said is that art lives on. Art was a window to the past, and art lives on. And when you think about the Sonnet 18 by William Shakespeare, he talks about that. Beauty is ephemeral, but a poem lives on, and also art lives on. So we get that sort of sensibility in this magnificent painting by Poussin. Another wonderful painting by Poussin is Landscape with Diogenes. Now, Diogenes was a Greek Stoic philosopher, and he believed that mankind should give up worldly goods to live a life of pure, philosophical, and good life. And he shows Diogenes watching a man. Diogenes, as a Stoic, has given up all worldly goods, and he travels the world to try to encourage people to believe in that sort of philosophy. And he only has his stick and a small bowl. But what this points out is that he sees this man in the foreground cupping water from the stream, and he realizes, I don't even need a cup. I can use my hands. So that is what's happening here. But also this very diffuse, very elegant landscape. It shows how interested Poussin was in the landscape. He would really study everything about nature. The architectural elements too are part of this, but these beautiful trees in this grove, and this diffuse paint color, which is a little bit unique. I'm going to go on to Claude Lorrain, and this pastoral landscape happens to be in our very own Timken collection, our French painting. It's Baroque, And we see that it shows classical ideals of beauty. We have this woman in the foreground bathing the feet of a shepherd, and we have a woman and a shepherd with goats and cattle going across a small stream. And we look at the time of day, this exquisite light. And it could be early morning or it could be closer to dusk. There's a harmony and sense of sensitivity to this landscape. Here we're really seeing landscape for landscape's sake, these French landscape painters. 17th century, we see much more of an evolution of landscape painting, and I'll talk about that more with the Dutch in just a second. So we have probably a walled fortress, again, another like a castle on the top of this rocky promontory. And we see this is not a religious subject. This is a landscape. And we also think of Arcadia, again, that perfect landscape where everything is harmonious and beautiful. When we go to the Dutch artists, and I'm going to focus on another painting in the Timken, this view of Haarlem and the bleaching fields by none other than Jacob van Ruysdael. Jacob van Ruysdael came from Haarlem. He documents a lot of Haarlem, which is just outside of Holland's great city of Amsterdam. In the 17th century, Holland was the strongest country in Europe. We've had the Protestant Reformation. Holland and Belgium are bifurcated. Holland is Amsterdam becomes a prominent city away from Antwerp in Belgium. And the Dutch have a great navy. They have a very solid economic basis. They're scientific. Remember, they're exploring things like optical devices and microscopes. And they support artists through more middle-class means. So people are buying art to decorate their homes and to show portraits of themselves. And we don't have to have a church or an aristocracy to promote their work. So this is the Haarlem bleaching fields. The bleaching fields are here in the center, the middle ground of the painting. We have this very low horizon line. That is because Van Ruysdael was very interested in scientific study. He looked at the clouds. And then this church, St. Bobbles, which happened to be at one time a Catholic church and it became Protestant under the Protestant Reformation. And he was buried there. We have the little cottages. We have the dunes, and we have this beautiful sky and clouds. Now, even though this is purely landscape for landscape's sake, I will point out that the Dutch often moralize in their still lives and their landscapes. And what he's suggesting is that life is ephemeral and that at any moment, clouds can bring on rain. So we do have a sensibility of a little bit of a religious overtone. He painted many of these views of Haarlem. I think he did something like 15 studies, and this is one of his most interesting. Just in about 5 minutes we have left, I may go over 5, I apologize. I do want to show you a couple French paintings. We just have a few to look at. This is Antoine Watteau. He was a predecessor to the Rococo movement, and he painted a lot of scenes post Louis XIV of the aristocracy at play. And here we have what is called a fête galante, an outdoor party, which is he really promoted. And we have the embarkation from Cythera. Cythera was said to be the birthplace of Venus. And these islands had real presence. I mean, when I was in Greece the last time, I actually went to the island of Delos, where it was said Apollo was born. But Cythera is said to be the birthplace of Venus. And we actually see the goddess of love and beauty here, a sculpture of her. And these are loving couples. And what Watteau is promoting is love and romance and pairing people up. And we have little cupids shooting arrows, and we have this golden boat, and these aristocrats who are just leaving this fête galante. Watteau was also important to the Commedia dell'arte. He depicted them and other theatrical venues. And even though it says embarkation, it's probably they're departing, not really embarking. He did not live very long, but he's very prominent. He very, very much influenced Francois Boucher. Just really quickly, Renata, I'm just going to go over 2 or 3 minutes. I wanted to show you another magnificent work in the Timken, and that is a work by Jean-Baptiste Camille Corot. Corot became a member of the Barbizon painters who painted the Barbizon woods. They were predecessors to the Impressionists. He didn't really think himself as a true Barbizon, but he did. He was important to that school, and he painted a lot in Italy. He was a world traveler. I mean, a world traveler when I say he went to Holland and Germany and France and Italy, and he loved to go to Italy. Volterra, I have been blessed to have visited, and Volterra has everything from medieval plaza to Etruscan ruins. The Etruscans were a death society. They believed in building necropolis like the Egyptians, so slightly different religious tenor to it, but they have their ruins in this town. So if you go to Volterra, which is in the Tuscan countryside, you will see not only Roman amphitheaters, Etruscan ruins, Etruscan artifacts in their museums, and then medieval plazas. So it's really remarkable. So Corot would go into the countryside in Italy, and he would document what he would see. And then he would sketch it. And then he would go back to his home studio and recount what he has seen. So we just see a pure landscape. The French were great at this landscape painting, particularly when we go into the 19th century. Now, the Americans during the Hudson River School also painted landscape paintings in the 19th century, and our magnificent Bierstadt, who was a German, he studied in Dusseldorf, and he was asked to document the Transcontinental Railroad from the east to west. And he was part of a sketching group that was a group of artists. You can see these artists in the foreground, and they're sketching the magnificence of this landscape in Yosemite that is sort of the first time non-Indigenous people are seeing it. And he documents what he sees. Now, it might be said that, well, you know, photography was invented at this time. Why aren't they doing photographic depictions? Because photography is used during the Civil War, Franco-Prussian War, but too cumbersome with all the chemicals and the daguerreotype format. It was much easier for him to sketch. So he was known to paint really sublime landscapes. This is almost considered sublime because we see the beauty of a waterfall and this mountain range. We also have a magnificent Hudson River painter, actually a luminous painter, and this is our very own Fitzhugh Lane. And Lane was interested in light, and we see this very quiet, contemplative Castine Harbor. Actually, during the Revolutionary War, Castine Harbor was a terrible battle that the colonial troops lost, but it is a beautiful harbor, and Lane could not be a naval officer, which he wanted to do, so he paints the harbors. So really quickly, in 1 minute, I want to show you one of the most beautiful painters of realism, and that's Millet. And Millet, Jean-Francis Millet. And Millet paints the gleaners. This is a monumental realistic landscape. We see these gleaners who are poor women who are just getting the detritus of the corn and wheat. And in the background, we have the real crops. And we see how these people were often stigmatized for their poverty and their humble circumstances. But Millet said, no, I'm going to show them in their beauty and power. So Millet is considered a realist painter of the 19th century. The last two paintings, a déjeuner sur l'homme. So Manet was really the father of Impressionism. He has a much more kind of Spanish Baroque sensibility, this black, inky black. He paints déjeuner sur l'homme, luncheon on the grass. And we see a naked woman. And if you look at the light in this landscape, it almost looks like it was a studio backdrop. And we have these two figures who are dressed. This is actually his Dutch brother-in-law, and this is two brothers combined in one of the Manet brothers. And we have a beautiful still life here and a bather. So we begin to see this experimentation with landscape. It goes beyond, it's really going into mystery and allegory. And then lastly, we're going to end here with Monet. So this is water lilies. And if some of you, I've been blessed to have gone to the town of Vernon and into Giverny, where he created his garden and studio, magnificent place to visit. And he did this Japanese garden with water lilies. He was an avid gardener. He created this exquisite heaven of gardens. And the Japanese bridge represents his interest not only in studying nature and light. He did that with haystacks and bridges and churches, but he also did this with the water lilies and this Japanese bridge. So because he was very interested in Japanese woodblock prints. Because I've gone over time and I really apologize, Renata will let us know if we have any questions or comments or suggestions. Gladly take those.
So thank you so much, Docent Halmerson, for such a fascinating and engaging tour at this time. If anyone has any questions, we would gladly take them, especially if they're short. But if not, okay, from Barbara, she says, thank you, Karen, such a wonderful lecture.
I appreciate your comment. That's really very important to me.
Lorena also says, what a wonderful presentation. Thank
you. I really appreciate viewers, and always feel free to ask questions. The questions are always really interesting to me, and they engage, they expand sort of our talk and help us see points that I might have missed or you observed that I might have overlooked. So feel free, please.
So if that's it, we have one more. Just a comment from Ryan. The presentation deck looks much cleaned up, no messy borders. Thank you for working on that. Karen, you are always so enthusiastic.
Well, labor of love for sure.
So with that, sorry?
Oh, no. My next lecture is in October, and I believe it is on the origins of still life, another favorite of mine. So that will be at the end of October. And we have other lectures that Renata is familiar with, and she might want to mention those. She might have those.
Yes. So if you would like to look at other tours that were previously put by the Timken Museum, those can be found in our social media channels like Facebook or our YouTube page. If you would like to also find further information about these tours, you can look into the Timken Museum webpage. So thank you again for joining us, and we are going to end this live stream now. So thank you.
Thank you. I hope it was okay.
It was great.
Thank you. And I'll ask for numbers. I'll email you guys if that's okay.
Yes, perfect.
Thank you for your help today.